It's the morning of July 2nd, 1863. The 9th Massachusetts Battery, attached to the Army of Potomac's Artillery Reserve, will march from Tawnytown, Maryland. They'll be held in reserve, but not for long. With a move that will befuddle both Major General George Meade and historians to this day, General Dan Sickles will move his undersized 3rd Corps from Cemetery Ridge to the Emmitsburg Road. Upwards of 3/4 of a mile ahead of the Union line, his corps now extends from the Cadore Farm on the north to the Peach Orchard, through the wheat field, and south to the Devil's Den. The 3rd will be stretched dangerously thin. To fill the gaps, he asks for support and receives it in the form of Colonel Freeman McGilvery's 1st Volunteer Brigade of the Artillery Reserve. The artillery would be placed along the Wheatfield Road, the furthest right at the Peach Orchard, which corners the Emmitsburg Road. The 9th would be placed on the far left, furthest from the Peach Orchard. The men are green but disciplined. This will be their first engagement. The 9th would get orders to move to Gettysburg in the early morning of July 2nd. They could hear artillery fire in the distance as they made their way up from Tawnytown. The road was now filled with men coming back from the previous day's fight. They would arrive at the artillery park located at the Spangler Farm around noon. Here the men would have some time to wait. Many would spend the time trying to get a glimpse of some rebels. The men of the 9th were seeing action for the first time. Most had never seen one. They would get their chance at the Spangler Barn, which was now a hospital. They would soon see more than they would want, because shortly after 4 p.m. they would be called to action. Leaving the Spangler Farm, they would cross over the Tawnytown Road to a farm lane that led through the George Weichert property to the Trossel Farm, most likely cutting across the field where the modern-day United States Avenue is. Located west of the Tawnytown Road and north of the Wheatfield Road were the farmhouse and barn. A gate and stone wall stood at the house running north to south. At the Trossel Farm, the men would hold as Bigelow and others survey the ground ahead. They would revisit this ground in the not-too-distant future. Now in the thick of the fighting, the 9th would line up in order, cannon 1 through 6, 1 being closest to the Peach Orchard and 6 being closest to the wheat field. Bigelow would notice that cannons 5 and 6 had no field of fire in this position, so he would order them move to the right. Now the order would be 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. Cannon 5 now closest to the Peach Orchard. They would first fire upon artillery in the far woods, most likely the batteries of Alexander and Cabell. Next, the Rose Barn, where sharpshooters were causing mischief. Bigelow's cannons quieted them. Kershaw's South Carolinians, who mistakenly turned to their right flank towards Rose Woods, would suffer horribly under Bigelow's guns. The mistaken order would allow the 9th to plow through them. Nearby, things were really starting to heat up in the wheat field. The 9th shelling of Kershaw's brigade would aid the men of the 18th and 22nd Massachusetts in the Rosewoods. But Kershaw's South Carolinians would regroup and send out a strong skirmish line in the Rose Field. All the while, Barksdale's charging Mississippians were overpowering the 3rd Corps in the Peach Orchard. The 9th position was becoming untenable. Firing from the right were Barksdale's Mississippians. They reformed after rolling through the Peach Orchard and were now bearing down on the 9th. The bulk of his men would move further to the 9th's right, avoiding their fire. The 21st would move straight towards the Trossel House and Barn from west to east as the 9th poured solid shot into them. Kershaw's men would receive canister as they advanced through the Rose Farm across the Wheatfield Road and into the Trossel Woods. All this time, the 9th is moving downhill back towards the Trossel House and Barn where Sickles' headquarters had been. Sickles was long gone, though, losing a leg to cannon shot. The guns now back at the Trossel Farm, Bigelow would order them to limber up. The leftmost guns, 3 and 4, would go first. One would overturn, blocking the gate to their escape. The next, seeing the gate blocked, would be pulled straight over the fence. The first was righted and removed. Just then, Colonel McGilvery came up and told Bigelow that there were no men behind him to quell the Confederate advance. The 9th must remain where it was and hold its position at all hazards, at least until he can find some guns to put in position to cover. They were cramped into a corner at the bottom of a hill. Ammunition would be laid at the guns to save time. Barksdale's men were now upon them, not to be denied even in the face of double canister. They would fight on in vain. McGilvery would finally give the order to retreat. Bigelow would go down. The battery's bugler, Charles Wellington Reed, would bring 2 horses to the line and slowly bring Bigelow to the rear. Retiring through Watson's Battery I, 5th U.S. Artillery, they yelled for him to hurry. Because of the pain, Bigelow was unable to hurry and told them to open fire. This would earn Reed a Medal of Honor. They would remain lifelong friends. Reed would also become a renowned illustrator, drawing many famous scenes of battle. Along with the human casualties would be the loss of 80 of 88 horses killed or wounded, upwards of 60 dead. The 9th Massachusetts Battery was able to buy enough time for McGilvery to get his artillery into place. McGilvery's Plum Run line would hold. Many men would suffer and die on the fields of the Trossel farm. 2 men that spent the night severely wounded on the field would live to tell their stories. They were John K. Norwood of Gun 5 and John B. Stowe of Gun 6. In his book, The History of the 9th Massachusetts Battery, Levi W. Baker sums up the plight of Norwood and Stowe at the Trossel farm. The situation at this time was as follows. The right gun, the 5th. Horses all killed and left 50 yards up the slope. 1 driver killed. Sergeant and gunner wounded and gone. 2 cannoneers wounded and 1 lying under the gun. The next gun, all but 1 horse killed. Sergeant wounded twice. 1 cannoneer shot through the body line in the enemy's lines. 1 other bruised in the back. The limber overturned near the gateway. Lying somewhere in the enemy's lines was Stowe. Lying under the gun would be Norwood. Guns 5 and 6 would be the first to be overrun by Barksdale's 21st. Norwood was on the number 5 gun, nearest the peach orchard, so in retreat it would end up closest to where Sickles had his headquarters along the Trossel Farm Road. Norwood is shot through the lungs while trying to limber his piece. If not for the help of battery mate Ralph Bladesell, the outcome may have been very different. The story is recounted in The History of the 9th Massachusetts Battery by Levi W. Baker. Lieutenant Whitaker's section received the first onset of the 21st Mississippi. The right gun, the 5th detachment, had its sergeant and gunner wounded. 1 cannoneer and pole driver were trying to limber up when the cannoneer, Norwood, was shot through the lungs. No one else there, and the remaining horses shot. The enemy were on the gun in limber. Their color bearer mounted the limber and waved his flag. Norwood lay for some time under the gun, and Bladesell, unharmed, remained with him, and, as the rebel regiment advanced, went along with them, saying, "I want to get some water for a wounded comrade." He was not hindered, and came back. He helped Norwood to go 50 yards to the shelter of a large tree and boulder under it, where he lay and kept the wound wet all night. Norwood says after he was laid down beside the rock, the enemy rested their guns over it and fired. Also during the night, he laid his hand on the face of a dead man laying beside him. In the morning, he was helped into Trossel's house, and afterwards to the Baltimore Pike. Norwood says he owes his life to Bladesell and cold water. Back along the Wheatfield Road, where the fighting started to go downhill for the 9th, Stowe, manning the 6th gun, is shot through the body and left on the field.
About the time we had orders to fix prolong, I was shot through the body. I went to the rear about 20 yards and I fell senseless. Soon recovering consciousness, I heard the orders to fall back. It was Corporal Whitney. He got me on my feet and tried to get me back with him. I could not help myself at all, and he was obliged to lay me down, gave me his canteen full of water, and reluctantly left me. I saw the enemy's line advancing and watched him till they marched over me and halted at a stone wall near some woods, and there they remained till dark. They then fell back over me and threw out a picket line, and I was left between the picket lines. There I was all night with none but the dead, save now and then a ghoul in gray, searching the dead and stripping them of their clothing. If seen by our pickets, they were fired on and driven away. The night was long and dark to me, and I thought if the boys could, they would come for me. Toward morning, a man in gray came near me. He appeared to be looking about, but not trying to strip any bodies. He stood looking at me, and I put out my hand and touched his foot, and he jumped as if surprised. He probably thought me dead. On recovering, he stooped down and asked me where I was shot, and if I was cold, and he got a rubber blanket and got it under me, and he covered me with 2 of woolen. He sat by me for some time talking, till it began to be light, and then gave me his canteen of waters, saying he must get back to his post. Daylight was welcomed, and with it the gray line advanced and occupied the position of the night before, and I was again inside the enemy's lines. They opened fire, and shot and shell came from all directions, and I almost gave up. I laid here till about 4 p.m. the 3rd day, when I decided to try and move. I made slow progress in crawling, but persevered till I reached the spring near the oak tree. As I approached, a picket on the enemy's outpost saw me, and he raised his hand, and no one fired at me, although the pickets were firing all the time. There I stopped, drank, and rested, and still the leaden hail was dropping around me. Next, still on my hands and knees, I tried to reach the house, through which, as I entered, passed a cannonball. The next day, the 4th, I was taken to the 2nd Car Hospital, and that night, with thousands of others, lay uncovered through a heavy rain. July 5th, William Strong and Charles Tibbets found me and had me carried to a house on the road to the village. On July 9th, I was taken to a church in town, and the 16th to McKim's Hospital in Baltimore. I was struck under the arm, passing through the lungs, breaking 2 ribs, and passing out.
John K. Norwood would be discharged in February of 1864. By 1867, he would be home in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and fully recuperated. He would become president of the 9th Battery Association, assisting John Batchelder in placing their monument. In 1883, he would return to Gettysburg. He would have a disagreement with Batchelder as to how many battery monuments there should be and where they should stand. He would return again in 1884 with a committee including Richard Holland. Like Charles Reade, Holland was also an artist. After reminiscing of their experiences, Holland would make a sketch of Norwood at the Rock, later to be known as Norwood's Rock. The committee would propose the placement of not 1, but 3 monuments. Those monuments now stand at the Wheatfield Road, the Trousseau House, and Ziegler's Grove. Known to be honest and ethical, he would open a successful fire insurance agency in Lawrence, making him a wealthy man. He would also become a member of the Needham Post No. 39 Grand Army of the Republic. A respected man in his community, he would marry and have 2 children, passing away in 1914. John B. Stowe entered the Invalid Corps in December of 1863 and was discharged by February of 1864. Living out his years in Biddleford, Maine, he would become a barber, the dean of barbers in York County. In the 1880s, he was made captain in the reserve militia with the Saco Rifles. Always proud of his service, he was often seen at Memorial Day parades honoring his time in the war and those he served with. He would also be named Post Commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, Fred F. Gurney Post, Saco, Maine. Widowed in 1865, he would marry again but have no children. His obituary mentions he was but slightly wounded during the war. Quite an understatement. An upstanding citizen and modest hero, he would pass away at the age of 96 in 1936.